Hey guys, Frank here. Welcome back to the Stargazer Man channel. The good folks at Dwarf Lab sent me the D2 to check out. I won't bore you with the tutorial stuff because, let's be honest, there are more of those videos on YouTube than stars in the sky, but some shine brilliantly and I'll point you to these as we roll along. What I really want to talk about is who exactly this telescope is for. Is it a good choice for you if you're a beginner and want to get into astrophotography? As of releasing this video, Dwarf Labs have just announced the Dwarf 3. I'll do a separate video on that model as it becomes available, but if you've just purchased the D2 or are thinking about it, don't be disheartened, as the D2 is a great unit and in this video we'll see why. I'm gonna guess that because you've clicked on this video you fall into one of these categories. You're a total astro noob and you're thinking about buying the Dwarf 2 and you want to know, does it actually do all the things they claim it does? And can you get started without any astronomy or astrophotography knowledge? Maybe you've already bagged the D2 and now you're scratching your head wondering how to set it up and align it correctly. What are the best settings for the different objects that you want to shoot? Why are darks a thing? And what the heck is a UHC filter? And when should you use them? I'll cover all that and recommend some great YouTube tutorials by others that nail these questions. Or you're an advanced amateur. Maybe like me, in the past you've done some old school astrophotography using the associated bits and bobs like EQ mounts, digital cameras, guide scopes, all that fun stuff. And you're curious to know, what's all the shouting about with these smart scopes? Here's the disclaimer bit. Any of the products that I'm sent to review or I review off my own bat, I do so without any expectation from the manufacturer or store that I'll give it a favourable review. If there are problems or things that can be done better, then I'll call it out. Later. But seriously, this is a great avenue we have on YouTube to keep companies in check for their products and to usher in positive changes. So, who's this scope for? I've used the Dwarf 2 now for about 4 months. We had a lot of bad weather at the start of the year, but I did eventually manage to really put it through its paces, testing as many objects as possible. And I even travelled with the unit on a flight to another country to see how difficult or easy that was, and more on that later. All the specs will be in the description below, but as you can see here, it's an incredibly compact Alt-Az design. Alt-Az being that it swivels from left to right and up and down. It's mounted on a small and surprisingly sturdy tripod that allows you to easily level the scope. I've used it in fairly windy conditions and not had a problem with it. The deluxe version comes with 2 solar filters and a light pollution filter, UHC or ultra high contrast filter, and these attach to a clever magnetic holder that sits securely in front of the lenses. There's also a spare rechargeable battery that gives around 8 hours extra charge, so with 2 fully charged batteries you'll have plenty of power. The telescope is primarily controlled via a smartphone or a tablet using the dedicated Dwarf Lab app, which is available for both Android and iOS devices. The app is central to the operation and functionality of the telescope, and I found setup a user-friendly process and the interface is well laid out for the various controls and settings. I didn't have any issues connecting or maintaining connection, nor were there any issues when the firmware was updated. And there were several updates made by Dwarf Labs in the 4 months I tested. Each one included the usual bug fixes, but also they really listened to the Dwarf community and took on board the feedback to keep improving, which shows they really care about their customers and the end user. Once you're connected, I suggest you take some time indoors to sit with your scope and get to know the controls and the user interface. I know this sounds boring and I'm sure you'd be really tempted to jump right in, but spending this time will really help you to get the most enjoyment out of the scope. The D2 has a default home position as seen here, where the body of the unit is parallel to the base and you can set this manually. When you're exploring the movement of the scope for the first time, you'll move the scope in azimuth left or right in one direction or the other, and there is a hard stop, so the scope doesn't have full 360-degree rotation. Similarly, the altitude or up and down control will move the lens cylinder to a hard stop in each direction, and your home or starting position will generally always be with the scope in line with the base and the lens pointing up 45 degrees. One of the coolest features I find of the Dwarf scope is the windowed view, where you can switch between wide angle and telephoto views. This is super useful when you're using the scope in landscape mode for daytime photography and trying to hone in on an area of interest. It's also very useful when you're trying to locate a celestial object, especially the sun or the moon. When using the Dwarf 2 in this mode, I found the on-screen controls were laid out very well and the speed control dial was very intuitive. I had some fun zooming around and in on planes, landing and taking off at the airport I was at, and the quality of the recordings were excellent. Then back home, I decided to try out the unit during the day at a nearby beach. Now, it was quite windy, but the telescope handled the vibrations quite well, and if it was on a sturdier mount, then I'm sure the footage would not have shaken at all. So for astrophotography use, I'd probably recommend putting it onto a sturdier mount at nighttime if it's windy, but if there's no wind, then the tripod supplied will work perfectly fine. Here you can see the view as seen in the app and the very impressive telescopic view of the beach 5 kilometers or 3 miles across the bay. And closer to me, I used the very clever feature called Object Track, which is great for automatically tracking a subject to keep it in frame. Once you have the desired object centered using the direction control arrows, hit Function and Object Track, then using your finger on screen, draw a box around it and the D2 will track your target for you. In this case, an oyster catcher searching for some snacks beneath the sand. So as I said earlier, the single best piece of advice that I could give anybody before they start to use this telescope is to RTFM. Read the flaming manual. This doesn't apply to just newcomers to astronomy. It also applies to anybody using the telescope, because I've seen on the Dwarf 2 user community page on Facebook countless posts from people who are getting super frustrated with the telescope, not really understanding what they're doing or thinking that there's something actually wrong with the scope itself, when in fact it's just that they haven't understood 100% how to actually use the scope. Now, to be fair, there's absolutely nothing wrong with people taking initial shots and putting them up for people to give advice on. It's one of the ways that I learned how to do astrophotography back in the day when there was really no Facebook and it was just message boards. You would put up a photograph and hope then some experienced astrophotographers would comment on it, and then basically you would learn every time that you went out. You take on a bit of advice and you would go and you would apply that advice to your next session and just try to get better and better. So I see this also with the Dwarf 2 user community. It's an absolutely fantastic community. One of the best out there that I've seen for any telescope, really. So do yourself a favor and join this immediately, and don't be afraid to post your images and ask for advice. But going back to what I said, the absolute best thing you can do before you do that is to just read down through this page to understand exactly what all of the features are and how to get the most out of your telescope. I'll run through this as quickly as possible and get to the good stuff where I'm showing you how to take photographs of those fantastic stellar objects. But I think it's just important that we run through the basics first, and I'll offer my honest opinion as well about the user interface. So as soon as you connect to the Dwarf 2, this is the screen that you will see. The very first thing that I did when I brought this scope out in the dark was to turn off the light of the ring indicator and the battery indicator, simply because they are green. Now, if they were a dimmer red color, wouldn't have had a problem with it really, but I was shooting with a group of astronomers, and obviously bright green in the dark is not going to make you friends with anybody. So that was the immediate thing that I did. I didn't think that they were completely necessary either, because obviously the app has its own indication of like your battery strength, and the ring indicator really is just a connection as well. So not too concerned about having these on. So maybe in a future update, Dwarf Lab might change this color to red. So this covers the device, helps enter battery level, remaining storage. So with battery level indicates the remaining battery life. And I really love the way they've written this article. One useless fact: when fast charging, the battery icon shows double lightning. Always remember to fully charge your device for your stargazing plans. So what I will say about the batteries is that if you have two in the deluxe edition, then you're going to have plenty of power to run for the whole night. And if you think that you're going to run out of power, then you can just use an external power source. And I'll show you how to do that later. The remaining storage, again with storage, never had an issue with it. I think that there's plenty of storage for your sessions. I would tend to download the files immediately after my session just to make sure that the storage doesn't get too cluttered. This is very important to read if you're starting off and you're having trouble trying to connect. It's very, very detailed, gives exactly what the issues are and what the steps that you need to do. And the bit of advice that I would give when you're going through these steps is to just take your time and follow the steps exactly as they are laid out here. If you do that, then 99.9% of the time things will work. Sometimes a connection needs a little bit of time to happen. Sometimes you might need to restart. Sometimes you might need to download some firmware. But be patient, because of all the times that I've had to do it, I've never had an issue. I know people have had issues with this and there are legitimate reasons why, but for the most part I think it's because people didn't read through this and really just kind of rushed it. I found the album layout to be very, very intuitive. And as you can see, it's categorized very, very well, automatically categorized by the type of photograph or the type of function that you use. So moving down through the menu, you have My Device. Everything here is fairly logically laid out. I won't go through all of the details here because it's fairly rudimentary. We'll talk about the device password. So the initial password that's set is dwarf_1234567 I tend to keep this the same because I just don't want to change it for fear that I'll forget the password. But there's a really, really good password reset option on the Dwarf as well if you forget it, so that's quite handy. The firmware gets updated quite often for Dwarf, which, as I said earlier, is a real indication that Dwarf Lab are paying attention to the user base and they're really trying to provide the best service possible and actually the best unit possible for their customers. The times that I had to do the firmware upgrade, I found it quite straightforward. There was a couple of times when I had decided I was going to go and shoot a solar transit or a lunar transit and hadn't updated in a while, and then when I turned the Dwarf on, it immediately wanted to update the firmware, and I didn't have any option to say update later, which I found a bit frustrating because I had to update the firmware and wait until it had done until I could begin shooting. And because I was under time pressure with the ISS passing over, it was a bit stressful, but I got there in the end. So in connections and settings, there's a couple of different features. One of them is activate Wi-Fi at startup. I use this all the time. Basically bypasses the Bluetooth step, allowing the Dwarf to start its hotspot signal when it powers on. Then there's station mode, which allows you to use your home router as a relay for the signal. You also then can enable 2.4 gigahertz. I love it here where it says this allows the Dwarf 2 to emit a 2.4 gigahertz signal, supporting connections with not very up-to-date devices, struggling to find a neutral word. But just be aware that, and as I mentioned here, if you do set it to 2.4 gigahertz, the transmission will cause a certain amount of lag. So there's two things in advanced settings. One is CPU mode. And they say here that acting this increases chip performance and generates heat. Some use it for defogging. This I absolutely turn on whenever there's any chance of dew or fog. And the reason why is because there is no specific dew heater built into the Dwarf 2. You can 3D print some dew covers that will attach onto the holder that goes, the magnetic holder that goes in front, but it's better if you have an actual powered dew heater. And we do get a lot of dew here in Ireland, and I do use this quite a lot, and I haven't really noticed that it reduces the battery power too much, so I'm not too concerned about you turning it on and losing power. Again, as I said earlier, you can always have a spare battery just to back it up, and for most astrophotography rigs you actually have to have a separate dew heater and power source for that. MTP mode is basically the mode that you want to set when you want to transfer any of the images from your Dwarf 2 to your PC. Location is what it is. You can set it automatically or you can set it manually. And then in general, you can change the language or the appearance. What I would say is I'd go for dark, because obviously white again is going to be quite glaring in the dark. Black is just a little bit less intrusive. Next is support, and this is really well laid out actually in the app, where if you want to report a problem, you can go through the page here and select the type of problem, submit a log, add your email address, the date that the issue happened, fill out a description, and even add some images, and then submit your support request. And they say they will contact you within 48 hours. I have found their support to be actually second to none. They're very engaged with their community, as I keep saying, and they're quite helpful. So you can be confident that they will reply on time, and they will give you very good advice when you ask them. Nothing to say about the About section except for the Update App part, which will indicate that there is an update once there's a red dot next to it. So once you're all set up and you hit photo on the main screen, you're going to be taken to this shooting interface. And the layout here is a little bit confusing at first, but once you have used it for a couple of days, it becomes pretty intuitive. And again, practice makes perfect. Try using it at home in the daytime, because it's going to be much easier for you to understand where everything is, rather than bringing it out at nighttime in the dark and fumbling around and getting frustrated. So the first thing to talk about is the dual lenses switch, and you saw me give some examples of those earlier with the birds on the beach and the metal birds in the sky. And again, this is very well laid out in terms of instructions. I would read through this thoroughly to understand exactly how to use the dual lens system. Now, sometimes the alignment might be slightly out, whereas you can see here, the green box indicates that it's this tower that they are focused on. It might be slightly off, and I'll put a link in the description below to a video where somebody has a really good explanation of how to align it. Next section is guide, and here there are some really nice little videos that Dwarf Lab have created. So if you get stuck in the field and you can't remember exactly how to do something, you can click here and it'll give you a hint. Joystick and speed control is how you would control the unit manually, and by clicking on this little speed icon here, it'll give you, looks like a speedometer, but basically it goes from 1 to 5, and that's just basically the speed. And then over here on the left hand side, you have this option here, which it'll give you a little circle that you can use your thumb to move up, down, left and right. If you don't like that, you can also click here and it'll give you some triangles, and I prefer this one because I find that it's a bit more accurate, and then you can fine tune your speed here, basically using two thumbs as if you were playing a video game on your phone. I find it very easy to use. Battery and storage displays the remaining battery and the memory. Something to note about the battery is that once it drops below 8%, that's pretty much it. You have to change the battery, but you do get good notification about that. Now, I used the Dwarf in some really cold conditions recently, and I didn't find that the battery depleted too quickly. I think the reason is because it's well protected inside the unit, and I have seen some people surround the bottom of the Dwarf unit with a dew heater, which will actually keep the battery warm. I don't think that that's really necessary, as long as you have a spare battery and then another external power source to get you through your session. So select mode is where you would choose the different shooting modes. Some people get a little bit confused about this because it's actually photo. So you have to click this to then get into the menu here to choose the different shooting modes. And we'll talk about the different shooting modes shortly. So with focus, you've got auto and you've got manual. I've found the autofocus to be quite reliable. There were a couple of occasions where it just couldn't nail the focus and I had to switch to manual, but that's not too much of a big deal. And I'll show you an example of when I was trying to focus on Jupiter. Another tip is always make sure that your unit is in focus before you start to calibrate. And the reason why that is the unit needs to be in focus for it to understand where it's pointing. If the stars are out of focus, it won't be able to do that, and calibration will fail, and you can just get super frustrated. Again, I've seen this time and time again on the forums where people are getting frustrated saying, hey, my Dwarf 2, it's broken, it's not able to calibrate, and it's simply because they just didn't set the focus before they started calibration. So another area that sometimes people get a bit confused about is this function area. So it's sort of hidden behind another menu, but when you click on it in the mode that you're in, it'll offer some features specific to that mode. So as you can see here with the square box, it's giving you these features. And then when you click on the little slider button down below, it'll give you some more parameters to select. And as an example here, it says that each shooting mode has unique features to choose from, like photo mode, and there are object tracking and sun tracking and moon tracking. And then in the parameters section underneath that for tele and wide angle lenses parameter adjustment. So this is important to know where to access it, because when you go to set up your shots, you're going to have to choose the shutter speed and the gain, and then decide whether you want to have the infrared as cut or pass. IR filter. So this is an infrared filter that's built into the camera, and in the daytime you need to set this to cut, otherwise you're going to get this lovely pink image. And in nighttime, when you're shooting deep space objects, you want it to be pass. And the reason why this is because you want to capture as much of the light bandwidth as possible, including up to the infrared. So then you have some other features like tone, white balance, and other settings, and play around with those and see what difference it makes. Generally in daytime, this is when you would use those. I love the way it says very important notes about parameters. Stop being mad at brightness changes and learn about the rules. So again, it's Dwarf Lab's very humorous way of saying RTFM. And effectively what they're saying here is that when the Dwarf is calibrating, it will automatically set itself to a shutter speed of 1 and a gain of 80. And then it stays at that until you begin your shooting, and you have to manually go in and change the shutter speed and the gain to what you believe are the best values for the object that you're shooting. So what I've seen happen is, and I'm clearly they have seen it too, is that some people will, after calibration, immediately move to begin shooting, and the Dwarf will say that there's a poor parameters set. So basically that's the reason why. So I'm going to take you through how I took my first photograph with the Dwarf 2. I was shooting M42, which is the Orion Nebula. So simply went into the menu and selected Nebula and selected M42, and the telescope had been calibrated, and within a matter of seconds it had located M42 and was tracking. Then the next thing to do was to go to focus to make sure that the focus was as good as possible. Now I see some people buy Bantanov masks and other attachments for focusing. I don't think these are necessary for the Dwarf. I think the unit itself does a really good job of autofocusing. And as you can see here, the unit will continue to go in and out of focus on the object as it's calculating the best position. And you can always move back over to manual to focus it yourself, but as I said, I've never actually had to do this. On some bigger scopes, maybe over the night when the temperature changes or the location that you're pointing in the sky will make a difference to the focus. I think the compact nature of the Dwarf 2 is not going to really necessitate that you do that. Okay, so I then go and choose my shooting settings, and for this first time I was going to use FITS. Brought it down to around maybe 200 shots just to see what it could capture. Sometimes the slider goes back as you try to scroll up, which is just a little bit annoying. Obviously I want the preview to be stacked, and binning is 4K. And then when I switch over to the other parameters, this is where I can set the shutter speed. So pretty dark skies where I'm at, so I set it to 15 and a gain of 80, and of course the infrared was passed to get that lovely infrared light from the nebula itself. And now the dwarf starts to stack these 15-second shots together. And effectively, stacking is really just to help gather the light that you want and discard the noise that you don't want. And the more you stack, the more light information you'll gather and the more noise you can subtract. So as you can see, we've now started to go into stacking mode on the preview, and you can immediately see more detail in the nebula. The stars are starting to get sharper and more definition in the structure. And you want to take as many photographs as possible and stack them together, because this is going to reveal much more detail than just a handful of subs. And as you can see here, I've sped up the stacking process, and even just in a short period of time, you can see how much more detail you're starting to gather just with a handful of light images. And this is the final image stacked, only 200 subs. You can see loads of detail in the nebula. There is a little bit of rotation, and that's got to do with how the unit tracks the object across the sky. Nothing to worry about. And then if you want to, you can load it into some post-processing programs like Siril or PixInsight, or even just on your phone. If you want to play around with the adjustments, you'll actually be able to get a very, very respectable image. And I was really blown away by the level and quality of the shots that I was getting from this unit. And these are all straight off the unit, unprocessed. And as you can see in my M42 example, if you want to spend the extra bit of time to really tease out all of that lovely nebulosity or the sharpness in the stars or the structure in the galaxies, that's very, very possible to do. And that's another day's work when we talk about post-processing. And I probably do another video soon enough on some of the quick and easy steps of how to post-process some of these images. So moving on to more local objects like the sun, we've seen the solar eclipse happen recently, and some of the images that the dwarf owners got when they traveled to that solar eclipse event were second to none. So I'm just going to quickly show you how you would locate the sun. By obviously you put on the solar filters, and then you can use the split screen where you have the wide angle view to kind of pinpoint the sun. And you can see here that I'm just manually centering the sun in that green little box. And then once I had the sun centered in the box, I then wanted to adjust the settings. So this is quite overexposed. So what I wanted to do was to bring the shutter down to as low as possible, so that I could see the detail on the sun, a sharp edge on the sun, and some sunspots were there, so that helped quite a bit. And as I said earlier, it really does pay off when you do your homework and figure out exactly what these settings do, because there's nothing worse than taking a telescope like this and bringing it outside and then just trying to, fool around with the settings and hopefully getting it in focus or the exposure correct. It's really not going to happen, and you'll get frustrated really easy. So the next step that I did was just to, again, hit the autofocus to make sure everything was nice and focused. And then the next thing to do was to get the dwarf to track the sun. And very easily that's obtained by going into function and then solar and lunar and hitting sun. You'll get a warning. Make sure that you have your solar filters on, etc. And the dwarf will locate the sun. And once it's found it within its field of view, it tracks it solidly. I didn't have any issues with the unit tracking the sun, never seemed to drift very far from center of the field of view. So quite impressed with that. And again, you can see here, I'm using the stacking feature, which allows you to take individual photos, stack them together, and it's the exact same process. What it's doing is it's stacking all of those images to really gather the best, clearest image of the object that you're taking the photograph of. In this case, it's the sun. And the reason why that helps with the sun and the moon is because it's going to beat the seeing. So the atmosphere wobbles a lot and will distort the image. And as you stack all of these together, it'll basically normalize it, and you'll end up with a much sharper image. And it's the exact same process for shooting the moon. And you can even use the unit in video mode to capture the likes of ISS transits across the solar disk and the lunar disk. So as I mentioned at the start of the video, I took the Dwarf with me in my hand luggage on a trip to New York to test out how easy or not it was to travel with. Obviously not ideal skies, but it was going to be interesting to see how the scope performed. Traveling with it was super easy, straight through the X-ray machines, no questions, same as a digital camera. So in my quest to do some astrophotography in one of probably the most light polluted cities in the world, I've got the unit packed up in the bag, and I'm going to head down to the river because that's got a nice kind of southern vista, so I can show you ahead. So right down in the middle there is kind of the tennis court area, and I'm going to set up there because it has the most expansive that I can kind of find locally in New York, and we'll see how we go. Truth be told, I don't have high hopes that this is going to work. I think it's going to struggle to find calibration because the brightness of the stars won't be enough for it to calibrate on, but we'll see. So it's very hard to see any stars in the middle of the city. I do see Jupiter, but that's about it. So we'll continue on down and see if we have any luck by the river. So this looks like the area that I'd seen on Google Maps. And as you can see, it's quite light polluted. Biggest issue really is there's these bright lights all the way down along the walkway. That's going to interfere, but I'm going to try and find a spot further down where there isn't any lights. So I found a place that's relatively free of any major lights overhead. Luckily enough, one of these lights is gone here. I've walked the whole way down to the end, and this is really the best spot, which is not really great, but it's the middle of New York. You can see Lady Liberty. So in terms of what I can see visually from this location, obviously I can see Jupiter, and over in this direction I can just about make out Orion. Sirius is quite obvious, and I can just about make out Taurus and the Pleiades. So the first object I tried to image was the Andromeda Galaxy, and again you can see here I'm just going through the settings and I'm setting up the shutter speed and the gain, and because it's in such a light polluted place I really could only have the shutter at about 5 seconds, but I left the gain at 80, and I decided to do a total of 100 shots, basically just to see could I capture anything at all. So as the unit started to stack away, we had 1 shot, 2 shots, 3 shots, wasn't having any high hopes. Then suddenly, boom, there was a hint of the galaxy. And as it continued to stack, you could see the structure of the core and begin to make out the satellite galaxy as well. And I've absolutely no doubt in my mind that with more time on this object, even at this completely light polluted location, you would get a very respectable image of this object. Next on to M45 or the Pleiades. Have to say these are not processed in any way. These are just straight off of the Dwarf II, and if you spent the time to gather more light and also brought these out into an external program, you would definitely get much better images. This was really a stretch. M33 didn't expect anything much, but the last object that I imaged was good old M42 or the Orion Nebula, and for a 10-minute shot from one of the most light polluted cities in the world, I was absolutely flabbergasted with the level of detail that the unit actually picked up and was able to provide. And with a little bit of extra processing, stunning images can be obtained with this telescope. And for me, this just proves that this telescope is suitable for people also in light polluted cities. Thanks for watching. Thanks for Dwarf for sending me the telescope to review. My final verdict is this little thing is going with me everywhere I go from now on. Highly recommended for beginners and advanced users alike. Clear skies and keep looking up.